Come join us as we dive deeper behind the scenes of security and cybercrime today, interviewing top leaders from around the world and sharing true cybercrime stories to raise awareness. But first, a huge thank you to all of our executive co-producers who subscribed to our Prime membership and fueled our growth. So please help us keep this going by subscribing for free to our YouTube channel and downloading our episodes on Apple or Spotify podcasts so we can continue to bring you more of what matters. This is Cybercrime Junkies, and now the show. Hey, welcome everybody. I am David Morrow, host of Cybercrime Junkies. Welcome to the show. I am joined in the studio today with my fantastic, always positive co-host, Mark Mosher. Mark, how are you today, man?
Good. How are you, David?
Doing well. So I'm excited about today's topic and today's discussion. We're going to be talking about how to prepare for a data breach, incident response from one of the leaders in the industry. We're joined by Executive Vice President, CTO at Solace Security, Chris Lair. Chris is a brilliant human and a solid guy who also currently serves as in the role at Solace Security CFC Response, which is a division of CFC Underwriting. We'll get into that. He oversees a team of cybersecurity professionals where they handle the firm's incident response and does a whole host of mentoring collaboration with small, mid-sized businesses and enterprise organizations across the country. Chris, welcome, sir.
Hey, I appreciate being here. It's a fantastic opportunity to talk to you guys and your audience.
Yeah, no, we're really excited.
For a small fee, we can follow you around and do that same introduction every time you walk in a room. So
yeah, I can walk into every meeting. You could just have me on Zoom. I'll just pop in, do that, and go. And now Chris Lair. And then
I just need some theme music to go with that.
Right?
Yeah, I know. We've got it. It's on a button right here. So that's fine. So our audience is mixed, right? We've got business owners, we've got people in cybersecurity field, IT, we've got people that are a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of brand experts, marketing. So our audience is all over the place. So what I like to do is kind of explain your role. And when you need to use acronyms and things like that, I'm just going to ask you just explain it in English for us, right?
Oh,
is
yeah,
that fair?
Definitely. No, that's the way I do it anyway. So it should
yeah,
be
I figured. So tell us about your current role. What do you do? And then let's back into kind of how you got there.
Yeah, so my current role is I wear a number of hats with Solace. So just to kind of, yeah, so Solace, half our business is incident response and half our business is cybersecurity. So we started doing cybersecurity for banks 20 years ago, and that's all we did. Back then it was information security, and a lot of the terms that we use today, fancy terms, we didn't have back then. But back then the banks were kind of forced to do security. Right? They actually had regulations. They had to be audited.
Weren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly
in terms of all the verticals, right? We see healthcare catching up. Legal is still way behind in a lot of spots.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
But the banks have been leading the way.
And I've always told people, hey, even if you're not a bank, if you want to reference an industry that's had to do it and do it for a long time, reference the banks. Their regulations and guidance is really good. So anyway, our incident response business, it's about 4 to 5 years. We did that. We just kind of stepped into it. I was at a peer group meeting. There was a friend of mine. They had a particular case, ransomware case. Somebody just called them out of the blue, and he said, "Hey, we don't do this. Can you?" And we said, "Sure." And we worked that case, and it just happened that that particular case had an insurance policy, and behind that insurance policy was a company called CFC, and they let us do the work. And they liked the way we
relationship grew.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Very quickly. So they were like, "Hey, you want to take on everything?" And we said, "Sure." And so we quickly did that. And so since then, I have had a lot of focus on the incident response side. And the team that reports to me out of that group is the business resumption team. And in layman's terms, it's kind of the first responders when somebody gets hit. Right. And usually it's a ransomware attack. So that's what we do. and
That's
they work
so
around the clock 7 days a week. It's crazy.
Yeah. And so, in a typical scenario now, an organization gets struck live by ransomware. We recently spoke with Robert Ciaffi, who was telling us about he was part of the massive ransomware. He owns a MSP, as you
Hmm.
know, you know him. And,
I know 'em well.
and yeah, exactly. And he was telling us how literally he was trying to communicate with some clients during the attack and saw his files be encrypted and go white, like live.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so when that happens, Solus Security is somebody that they can call. Now, generally when they call their insurer, they will have somebody that either has Solus Security or somebody like you guys, right?
That is usually correct. Yeah. So there's two ways it kind of works. The carriers themselves, they usually have some method of contacting them. It could be through a website, could be through a web app or a phone number. Sometimes your first call may be a law firm, and then that
Mhm.
law firm will engage an incident response firm that they have a relationship with that the insurance carrier has approved. Or, like in our case and other carriers, the incident response firm calls you first, determines whether or not what's going on, what the impact is, what kind of degree, and then we bring the law firm in. So that's pretty much the two use cases that can happen. And if you have cyber insurance, it's a good idea to find out how that works at a high level, because you don't want to find it out in the middle of a fire.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We were talking to Lester Chang, who is in head of security over at BMO Bank, and he was saying how, like, to build operational resilience, there's like practice that, right? Go through at least annually, go through, and because if you have policies, that's great, but until it hits the fan, you're not you're not going to know. It's almost like a living RACI document, right? You're not going to know who needs to be aware of something. You're going to make errors, right? And it could really cost you. And so doing
Yeah,
that.
it is important. And when I talk about this, or when I conduct or facilitate tests as well, what we try to do is, instead of just running through like a monotone script of a scenario and getting it done in 15 minutes, we try to add as many elements into that to determine whether or not the people that are filling those roles are the right people during that time. I mean, you could have a person that's perfectly cool, calm, during the normal workday, but when they're put in a pressure situation, you may have never seen how that person reacts. And the last thing you want to do is put somebody like that in a critical role in a disaster or incident response situation, and they just flake out or get upset, or teamwork is super key at that point. So
Yeah.
really, going through the rehearsal is more than just not knowing the stats, but just knowing the people and knowing, hey, do I have the right people in the right seats during an incident situation?
Yeah.
No,
We want all,
that's a great point, because I think a lot of times organizations overlook that aspect. Like, the person can be completely qualified, have the right skill set, but you don't know how they're going to execute given the scenario that they're in until you put them in that scenario. So that's a really great piece. I'm glad you shared that, Chris.
Yeah, and especially, not to, I mean, pick on them, is if so especially in the small business world, you have, usually single owners. And those people, their business life and their life flashes before their eyes when these things happen. I mean, they immediately see the bad that could happen out of this. Their business could close down. They may have to lay off employees. I mean, there's a number of different things that could be the outcome of one of these attacks. And they usually are the ones that freak out the most.
yeah.
It's amazing. And, what I usually say is, the first 24 hours after one of these events, it's pretty calm. People are pretty cool, but it's after that first day, kind of, these things set in, and that's where you start to really see those emotions boil up, and they, a lot of times, they take it out on the lawyers or ourselves, which we didn't put them in that situation. We're trying to help them get out of the
Right.
situation. So it gets really, really difficult in certain times. I mean, I'm not going to say it's every time, but in certain times, you really have to deal more with emotions than you ever thought you would have to in these types of situations.
Yeah. And it's a tricky scenario if you want to test how somebody does under the time of crisis and severe pressure, right? If you don't practice that ahead of time, right, you're really not going to know. Are you finding when you go and you get in that scenario, are you finding organizations that are well equipped and prepared, or is it what most people assume?
That's what most people assume, right? So it's interesting because
they've heard of ransomware, but they've never really practiced. What do we actually do? I have a lawyer. I have an insurance policy. I'll find that in my file drawer on my PC and call them, whoever I'm supposed to call, if that ever happens. They won't hit me. I work in Kansas. Don't worry about it. I'm too small. Right?
That's exactly
Which is absolutely not true.
No, it's absolutely not true. Or, I would say a couple of years ago, the attitude overall was it'll never happen to me. I would say these days that more people now know of someone that has been hit. So at least it's a little better, but they are somewhat prepared. But it's interesting because, we talked about knowing if you have one of these situations, who to call and how that kind of process works. We do have policyholders that will call us ahead of time and go, hey, we really kind of want to understand this. Do you mind getting on the phone and talking us through this, so we can update our plan? Definitely, we'll spend 15 to 30 minutes to do that. And guess what? Those people never call a claim because they're incredibly prepared, and it's a sign of their maturity.
Right.
And so but most of the time it's not the case. This is their first, scent of a cyber incident. And usually it's a bad one. Typically they're not a minor, it's full blown, you're down, dead in the water, what are you going to do type situation. And they're not prepared at all. And if we do find somebody with a plan, that plan is not reflective of anything that you would do in reality.
My personal experience, Chris, has been that ransomware has gotten, and I'm basing this based on conversations with organizations that have gone through ransomware attacks, that the extent and harm that it causes in the last year or two is exponentially worse than it was 5 years ago. Is that because of the evolution of the ransomware gangs? There was Lockbit 1.0, now there's Lockbit 3.0, like it's getting more harmful, or are you not seeing that? It's always been bad.
No, it is definitely worse in my opinion, in different degrees, right? You're seeing more. So when we first started this, there wasn't necessarily a particular type of victim. I mean, even back then, small, medium-sized, large, didn't matter. Nonprofit, profit, they could care less what business or whatever you're in. If you're a charity and just basically doing everything you can to stay afloat, to
Hey everyone, as you know, we routinely discuss how risky it is for brands to rely just on passwords or weak old-fashioned multi-factor authentication systems. It's your brand and we want you to protect it. Today we're excited to be sponsored by a next-generation authentication platform, Beyond Identity. Did you know 80% of breaches are the result of stolen credentials? Why does your organization still rely on passwords as part of your authentication process? Beyond Identity enforces continuous risk-based authentication, a fundamental tenet of a zero-trust security program. Check the link in our show notes and go to beyondidentity.com/podcast to get a free demo. That's beyondidentity.com/podcast to get a free demo. Beyondidentity.com/podcast for a free demo today. Or simply click the link in our show notes below. And now the show.
Do the things that you're supposed to do from a charity perspective. They didn't care. So we've always seen that kind of attitude. I think what we have seen is more organization around these groups kind of behind this, more sophistication just with their processes and tools. I mean, these groups recruit people, they buy tools, they do a number of different things. But I think the marketplace, if you want to call it that, that's this criminal marketplace behind all these things where people are going out stealing credentials and then trying to figure out if they can access a particular network, and then turning around, packaging that up and selling it to these groups, and they're buying it and going and doing their thing with it, whether it's just going in and stealing data and encrypting or whatever attack they're doing. There's just a ton of money. And the phrase I always use, it's the highest reward, lowest risk business you can be in from a criminal perspective, because
Absolutely.
the chances of them actually figuring out who you are and then finding you and then extraditing you and then indicting you and then you serving any kind of meaningful time with the way the laws are written. I mean, why not? If you can make 6-7 figures in an attack and not get caught, hey, keep it up. It's easier and better than robbing a convenience store.
Right.
And speaking with people that are affiliates in those ransomware gangs on the dark web, like we've done, or speaking with people that are regular contact with them, there are rules of engagement, right? If they live in a country that doesn't really have extradition in the United States, so long as they don't go after organizations that are tied to that country, they're left alone, right?
Yeah.
And it's just about making money. And when we talk money, we're not talking a new car or a new house even, right? We're talking buy an island type money.
Yeah, you're exactly.
I
I
mean,
mean, the people behind those groups are amassing a lot of money. And I've always said it even before the Russian-Ukraine conflict, and people ask about this,
Mhm.
is like, if you're Russia, let's just, not all these people emanate out of Russia, but let's just say
No.
for the argument's sake, they do, for the majority of them do. I mean, if you're Russia, you have this massive amount of money being transferred out of the United States and other Western countries into Russia. I mean, why are you gonna upset that, right?
Right.
That's great. I mean, that's revenue coming in my country that's turning into tax revenue, usually somehow, some way.
Yeah.
And so there's really no motivation with law enforcement over there to do much about it. They'll do it, in my opinion. They in the past, prior to the conflict, I believe that there were some busts that were, I would call it, primarily symbolic.
Like the
But
R evil takedown.
exactly.
Yeah,
They had
right
the
before the
cameras,
invasion.
lights. They had the microphone in the guy's
It
face.
was
They
like
had
a
it all.
60-minute episode. It's like they called 60 minutes ahead of time, right?
Exactly right. And who knows if that person was low level, medium level? I mean,
Right.
that you never hear anything from that perspective. So yeah,
No.
but you're right. They do. Yeah, but I'll say that's a change. I will say that in the past, the rules of engagement were better. Like they were, like there. I don't know if that's in today's segment, but there was that children's. I think it was Children's Hospital.
Yeah,
or whatever
sick
that was
kids
it.
up in Canada, and it was Lockbit 3.0.
Yeah, so
Yep.
that's an example where they're like, "Hey, our bad. Here's the decryptor," and they, supposedly fired that affiliate. That was, and for most, what it was an affiliate. Think of affiliate as like a contractor.
Yeah,
That-
it's like an independent contractor salesperson. You go,
Exactly right.
you eat what you kill. We'll give you a generous portion, and they can make millions of dollars, right? And we don't know you, you don't know us. So even if you get taken down, you don't even know who we are, and it's a phenomenal organized crime model, right?
Right.
I mean,
And we
in
see
terms
that.
of efficiency.
It's some people get kind of chills at their back when I kind of talk about this because they think that I'm actually kind of giving these guys props. And I'm not really giving them props.
Not at
But
all.
when we use the
No.
term organized, they are incredibly organized. I mean, they have
Mhm.
structure, organizational structure. They have a hierarchy. Like I mentioned earlier, they recruit people. They have campaigns to recruit people.
It's very similar.
Contest. I tried to participate in.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly
Lockbit
right.
3.0 has got the tattoo contest. I had to hold Mark back from participating in it.
Hey, you got $1,000 and you got to become an affiliate.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
he was like, think of the cool hat I can get, man. It would be like, and the story I could tell. I'm like, don't even get off the dark web and let's go back to
That's
work.
exactly
Close the
right.
laptop and back away.
So let's back up a little bit, Chris. How did you get to where you are? Like when you were a kid, there wasn't
Oh, wow.
cybersecurity. Like
No,
at least when I was a
that's pretty-
kid, there
that's pretty
wasn't.
funny. There wasn't.
You know what
no.
I
When you
mean?
were a kid,
Like
there wasn't an
how
internet.
did you first get the taste for it? Like
Well, when I was a kid, back then you had modems and you could dial into places and mess with things. So you might be able to dial into, back then sophistication was if their environmental controls were be able to be remote access from a modem. So you could dial in and turn the air conditioner way down and turn the heat
Right.
way up and do that type of stuff, right? And you can only do so much with a modem, and that was the thing. I mean, there were people doing other things like getting free long distance and all that kind of cool stuff, right?
Oh yeah,
So,
the freakers. We've
Yeah,
spoken with a lot of
exactly.
people that got started doing that.
black box, blue box. I mean, all those kinds of right, exactly.
Yep.
So I actually did. I had a BBS and all that kind of stuff, and was getting software, and that was, 0-day wears was the term, man. If you got that
Yeah.
game when
Yep.
the day came out, right? It
Yep.
might take you 7 hours to download it, but you got it. And then, really, I kind of in high school didn't do anything from a computer perspective that much, right? I had a job and girlfriend and all that kind of crazy stuff, right? And so when I got to college, though, I was a business major, and there was a fraternity brother of mine that was 2 years older that was in a degree called Management of Information Systems in the business school. When he told me about that, because I didn't want to program. And I said, all right, I'll do that. That looks pretty cool. So I did that. And then when I got out of college, I went to work for a private company that's big at the time, the largest privately held collections company, debt collections company. Started doing real estate collections, then got into credit cards. Massive growth. But he is now passed away. But the founder and CEO of that company, he was incredibly paranoid about security. And I mean, to the point where there were bug sweeps. Our head of security.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the head of security was a guy who was retired from the
Physical
Secret
security, paranoia. That's
Yeah, he was incredibly
interesting.
paranoid. He didn't trust anybody. Literally, that was. I mean, you learn that in onboarding. Like, he didn't
It's a
trust
great
anybody.
experience for going into the banking industry,
That's
right?
exactly right. That thing shut down. There's a whole history lesson probably, but anyway, then I got into the banking world.
He wasn't the guy down in Kansas City, was he?
No, he was in Tulsa.
Oh, Tulsa. Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
so he was Tulsa. So, and so it's kind of weird because that company was CFS. And so there's
wow.
Interesting.
three-letter CF acronyms are killing me, but yeah. So then I got into banking, and that's where I got my taste of regulations, right? But when I went to that bank had recently been acquired by a group that took it public, and at the same time, this group, the small group, was going to then flip it, and it was kind of their retirement plan. They'd been in banking a long time, a number of them, and they said, we're going to get together. We're going to take this bank. It's a 100-year-old bank. We're going to flip it. And it took a little bit longer, but during that process, we changed out everything in that bank, every application, pretty much everything infrastructure wise. We did some acquisitions ourselves and everything, but then we got acquired by a larger regional bank. But anyway, that whole point set me up for security. So when I was at that bank, I met a gentleman by the name of Terry Oring, who worked for a company at the time called S1. And S1 is an online banking software company and IVR, phone response, right? And they had started a managed security service practice in MSSP for banks.
Interesting.
And but then the dot-com bust kind of hit. They sold that book of business off to what is today SecureWorks. And Terry decided, hey, I'm going to form my own company. And he came to me and helped him come up with his name. And from there, we became a client. And I was a client of his from that bank prior to being acquired. And then after acquisition, we were a client. And then I worked at that bank for a while. Went over and worked over at USAA. So people that know of USAA, if you've been a member or even seen the commercials, those Gronk commercials, I'm not going to comment, they're terrible. But anyway, but from a USAA perspective, it's based in San Antonio, where I'm at. That is one of the most secure culture companies that you're ever going to be a part of. Like, it's amazing. But you walk in there, so everything, like even getting on campus, you got to show your driver's license. There's a sticker. Getting in the door, I mean, you can't tailgate anybody. The way the systems work there, I mean, it's incredibly secure. But it's incredibly open once you get in there, meaning like it's a very positive culture. But from a security perspective, you know what you're supposed to do and you're not supposed to do. And so what was interesting about the bank is the bank was very audit focused, regulatory, just all the time. By the time I was done at the bank, I think 70 to 80% of my time I was reviewing reports and signing off on stuff instead of actually doing what I'd signed up to do, which was IT.
Right.
But then when I got to USAA, I kind of saw the other side of it, how you can still get work done. And then in a very secure culture. And it was an amazing place. I'm not going to underscore how amazing, and I learned a lot there. But then it was a good time to come over at Solace, and we're going through a period where banking was flat. The economy and shifts in the administration kind of put the end to people starting up banks and merging and acquisitions, all that kind of fun stuff. And so then I went to work for Solace, and I told you the rest of how we got an IR. Yep. So it's a cool ride. It wasn't one of these things where I decided one day I was going to go get a book,
a cert, and study it and switch careers.
It's always kind of been part of what I did. And now it's more, because we don't do any type of IT work. We used to have an MSP, but when we were acquired by CFC a few years ago, we spun that off, and then they got acquired and rolled up into a larger MSP. So yes, we don't do any of that work anymore. So it's just security all the time. So it's fun.
Excellent. That's a phenomenal background. So in the banking industry, compliance obviously is key, right?
Yes.
And the federal regulations, et cetera. So there's always a discussion around how does compliance relate to security? Because they're not the same whatsoever. They're interrelated, but what's your take on that? Like, how do you explain the difference?
Yeah, so you can be secure, and when I always tell people, and I was speaking to a number of agricultural consultants earlier this week about this. I said, okay, one rule about security is if you put something in place, you need to make sure you have evidence and an audit trail behind it to prove that you have it in place.
Okay.
So if you kind of think of it that way, from secure, you're making sure the place is secure, your assets are secure, your data is secure, whatever, and then kind of the compliance part is the evidence that you have it in place. Now, it gets a little bit different depending on the industry you're in. Is from a compliance perspective, you may have to articulate the way you do things in very specific terms. So if you're in healthcare, you're going to want to make sure that your policies and the things that you're doing and the things that you're writing fall in line and use the verbiage and vernacular that are in regulations around healthcare. Same thing goes with banks. You're going to use banking terminology and that stuff. And often you may get into companies that fall in different industries. So you may have to have one report that is the same data, but is presented 2 or 3 different ways to appease whatever you need from a compliance perspective. So that's the big deal. But the other thing about compliance is that security may have its own compliance. At the same time, you may have other areas of the business that have compliance requirements that security is a part of, right? So you may have,
Right.
the banking world,
HR,
HR,
legal,
whatever, that has a
right.
security component of it, right? So the bigger you get and the more complex your business gets, if you obviously if you have one focus, that's easy. But when you start to have multiple focal areas, then you may need to kind of change up your policies and stuff. But the real rule is just be able to do what you say you're going to do and be able to prove that you're doing it. And I mean, that's an incredibly important lesson. I learned that when I was at the bank. We got into, just that when you get to a certain size, you start to have patent trolls come after you. And one of the things that really helped us was with policies. And when you would have the other party's attorneys question you about policies, and you could show those policies, you could show a history of those policies being reviewed, and you could show the evidence that you were doing what you said you were doing with the policies, it was very hard for them. And believe me, they're going to try to find a crease, a crack, or whatever they can.
Oh, sure.
So that's the real rule, man. You can do all the right stuff in the world, but if you just don't have the paper trail behind it, when it comes time to prove it, you're going to face a losing battle.
Absolutely. So compliance is the proof that you are implementing security policies and systems and tools, right?
And you may do a lot more than what compliance requires. So you rarely,
because you can be. Is it fair to say you can be compliant but still not be securing your organization's brand?
Exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. I mean, you can take. I'll give you an example. When NIST 853 came out and it's the NIST for the people that the DoD contractors that handled controlled unclassified information. That was a compliance deal. It was written from a security perspective, but I knew people that were in that space, and they could do things to check those boxes. And then from a security perspective, you go, that's not really enough, But from a compliance perspective, they could check the boxes.
They could check the boxes, right?
Yeah. So it's rare that you could say, hey, I'm this compliant and I am secure with a industry regulation or something like that. I mean, so yeah. And then really, in of course that you're seeing it over there with CMMC now is you want to be audited because you want to be proven. You want to be able to pass an audit time and time again. And if you have a good auditor, they're usually going to bring some benefits to the table and say, hey, maybe you should do this, do that. Maybe next time you do this test, you should bring this other person in, that type of stuff. Good. And so that's really where you're at when it comes to compliance, is doing the right thing, being able to continue to improve that going forward and continue to be audited.
Yep. So when you guys are doing IR, and that's incident response, coming in right of boom, right? Meaning after the incident has happened. What are you finding in terms of how long the criminal adversary, what a lot of people just deem and they call hackers, right? But not all hackers are criminal adversaries.
Yeah.
So
and we kind of
how long are they
actors.
inside? Yeah, threat actors. How long are they usually inside a network undetected before people start noticing or detecting? And it's going to vary, I'm sure, based on what
it is going to vary.
What systems they have in place.
Mm-hmm. The groups that are going after the big dollars usually are in there longer amounts of time. Okay. So it could be 2 weeks, it could be a month. You could see it going longer, and sometimes you even see indications of maybe a prior smaller attack that was kind of whatever knowledge was gained there was then turned over and sold to whomever that's doing the larger attack.
Right. Like selling the access to precipitate another attack, a bigger attack.
Yeah, like IABs, like initial access brokers, people that go in, they don't intend or know how or want or have interest in executing the attack. They just wanted to crack in, and they have that. They'll go and sell that on the dark web. We have access to ABC Corporation.
That's exactly right.
Right.
And for those out there, they actually have money back guarantees in a way. So if that access doesn't work, then they then have to return whatever funds were transferred to them, by the person that bought them. So again, kind of back to this kind of marketplace and the objective. The thing about time, though, is we do see some groups that get in there very quickly, right? They get in on a weekend and they flip it pretty quickly. And we see those types of attacks are like, we've seen these attacks where they just go in and encrypt hard drives. They might use BitLocker. In the past, there was a tool, and they never developed their own tool. They would use some off-the-shelf disk encryption tool
through ransomware as a service, right? Right.
Yeah, so they would just go in and encrypt your hard drive. So you can't get into jack squat. You then have to buy whatever the BitLocker keys they set for you. Those guys, that's all they're after. They're just after to lock you up, get paid, and get out. But these other guys, the lock bits and these Play and all these other ransomware groups that are out there today, they're the amount of data they're taking, right? So it used to be they might take some 100, 200 megs, and then it got to a couple of gigs, but you're starting to see in the a terabyte plus. I mean, even cases up to 10 plus terabytes of data. So that's going to take some time.
So they're going after they're going after not only the intellectual property, but as much customer information, employee data, everything, so that they could blackmail
that's exactly what it is. The more and what's interesting about Lockbit, and this made news probably a month or 2 months ago, maybe. So when you're dealing with these threat actors, one of the things that you try to do is you say, okay, hey, they go, we took your data. You're like, prove it, proof of life. And they would provide you samples of what they took, or maybe a snapshot of a directory structure, something of that nature. But they came out and said, hey, we're not going to do that anymore, because they ran the statistics. They probably had their numbers guy in the back, and they were crunching numbers, and they found out that the people who ask for the file listings and the proof are the ones that are least likely to pay. So they've taken a stance that we're no longer going to get proof of life. So now, that used to be a big deal for people to say, well, I'm in this situation. What data did they get? Oh, that's meaningless data, or, oh my God, that's embarrassing data, or whatever. Because a lot of people miss out on, hey, it's not just about credit card numbers and social security numbers. It's about data that can potentially embarrass you as a company, maybe as an individual. It could create strife between customers or vendors or whatever you have contracts with. So there's a lot of leverage that these guys use. And so having that proof of life helped make those decisions. But without it, now people are like, they have to kind of do their best to guess, because, back to the earlier, like, what do you see how well people are prepared?
Right.
We rarely get into an organization that's been hacked where they have like good logging in place. Because if you have good logging in place, you're
able to spot anomalies, right? You're able to see weird stuff, people moving around the network that are unauthorized.
Exactly. We can say, oh man, somebody was in your network last Friday and they were in there for the last week and they were doing this stuff. And this is exactly what server they were on. So we know. Well, most of the time that doesn't exist. So we have to go with a more difficult and arduous journey through forensics, and that takes time. There's no magic button. There's not something you just cut and paste in Google and it gives you an answer. It just doesn't work that way. So that's the point is it takes some time. So if you're in these situations, you're not going to get a quick answer anymore, especially depending on what group that's hacked you. You're not going to get a quick answer of what they took, and then you just have to do it. So my point to people is, one thing that people seem to still not focus on enough is data security. People just keep too much stuff.
Yep.
And
they keep
that
in ad hoc locations, right? They
yeah.
stored in a bunch of different places all over the place, and we don't know all the vulnerabilities. There's shadow IT where people are bringing in devices, connecting them to the network that the IT team doesn't even know about.
Yeah. And somebody exports a list. I mean, this one comes up a lot where like, our HR system, it's hosted. We use, whatever role service or whatever. But then you just ask a simple question. Well, what about 401k stuff? And they're like, and you're like, do you guys have like a spreadsheet that has everybody's information for 401k enrollment purposes? Oh yeah, we do have that. Boom, done. And then a lot of times and then they're like, well, we only have 35 employees. Well, how many employees have you had over the last 10 years where that data is in there? Oh, that's in the hundreds. And that's in a small company. You get into other situations and they find out they might have a spreadsheet there of thousands of records, tens of thousands of records in one spreadsheet. And so back to your point with either it's, we can argue shadow IT, or we can argue just capabilities in these platforms. You've made it real easy for people to export data and to crunch data and pull in Excel and do all that kind of stuff. Well, there's no management around that data. That data is going to come to bite you if those guys get a hold of it.
Yeah. And what are you finding in smaller organizations? Are you finding, is there an issue that you see after the fact, after you guys get involved, on how they were offboarding former employees? Because when we are engaging with clients, especially in the SMB space, we find that there are hundreds of clients or former employees. We find that there are hundreds of former employees that their access still hasn't been turned off even after they've been terminated or left voluntarily. Are you guys seeing that too?
Yeah, you definitely see. That's one of the first things when you get in there. And if you just do like a quick just glance at Active Directory as an example, I mean, just usually the number of accounts that haven't logged in the last 90 days is greater than the number of accounts that have logged in.
Right.
And that's just employee stuff. And then you have just a bunch of other like system or service accounts that have been there forever, and no one knows why that is, right? I mean, we've, and it's no different whether you're just a ordinary Joe business or a technology business. I mean, we've seen it with technology providers too, where there's accounts set up and they know it was set up for some particular reason 5-6+ years ago. They just never did anything about it. They just left it alone. Maybe somebody glanced across it. It kind of comes back to that compliance piece, right? If you have pieces in place that you have normal reviews and you ensure that those reviews are done, you should be able to catch those things and deal with them. But no, I mean, it's interesting though, those number of those stale accounts, we don't see those stale accounts. And I don't want to say they're not a risk. They're a huge risk. Don't get me wrong. But obviously the bad guys find an account of an active person through phishing or whatever, and they grab those credentials. Then once they get in, then they take advantage of maybe some of those other credentials that are in there that have admin access. And the same thing goes with, platforms like Microsoft Office or Office 365, Microsoft 365, whatever you want to call it. Small organizations have the tendency to give everybody or a majority of people global admin
access.
It's incredible. And for whatever reason, we want to make sure they can reset a password or do whatever. And oh my gosh, that's brutal, because all it takes is one mailbox to get popped and then the whole tenant is popped. And so, it's small business and account control, whether it's
Active Directory. They're all interrelated. Yeah, and they're all interrelated, aren't they? Because we see, poor security awareness training happen across the board, and then users have terrible password policies. So when they become a former employee, right, being able to compromise, and they're in a couple other data breaches because of some app that they logged into or whatever, and they use the same password, right? Then those former employees, those passwords, those usernames, et cetera, could be used to get right into your organization.
Yeah, and then once they have that, I mean, it's just too easy for them to move around the network. I mean, that's the other thing we see is, and I mean, look, small companies, you can get too small where this doesn't make any sense, but there's a point where, the access is one thing, just cleaning up your data, getting rid of old data that you don't need. But the other part of it is you need to look at your network and understand if there's areas where you can segment things off, right? I mean, it's
Yep.
amazing how many networks, even larger ones, I mean, in the thousands, where it's just one big giant, what we call a flat network. So once an attacker gets in there, it's easy for
They're
them
able to go everywhere.
They just run a discovery tool that everybody, it's just an open source download type discovery tool. They're not using anything fancy. They look around the network. They see exactly a server that's called file server or files or FS or whatever. They know that's where they're going to focus. And it makes it easy when you segment things. It makes that much, and you segment things correctly. It makes things a lot more difficult for them to do discovery and look around and poke around and that type of stuff. I mean, virtualization is a great example. We see where people have the hypervisors, which is kind of the command or the management for all of your servers. That just sits on the same network as everything else. So the attackers find that, they get into those, they lock all the people that need access out of those hypervisors. So you can't even get into that to shut down a server, restart a server, whatever you need to do. And so, yeah, it's just people, I think when phone systems came out, people segmented for phone systems. They just left it alone. And 20 years later, no one's in the small side of things. Enterprise, they're taking it to the micro segmentation degree.
Right.
But so, yeah, and segmentation, incredibly important in today's world. People would just do that. It would be make it a lot more difficult for these bad guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And so outside of ransomware, are you seeing that when the attack doesn't involve ransomware, that threat actors are inside a network for longer or for less time?
So if you take
I'm
away
just curious if you see any difference.
Yeah. Well, not so. There are some groups that just go in and take data.
Right.
So I would say
and
it's
just
pretty
sell
similar,
it
right?
or whatever, right?
Yeah, they just sell it. So they might be in there a little bit short of time because they're not worrying about the encryption part of the deal, but it's negligible. It's not that big of a difference. I would say the majority of the stuff is ransomware and email compromise cases. And obviously email compromise cases, those guys are just lean and mean. They get in there and they make their connection, they pull down email and they're off to the races. So they're usually not in there that long. But we also see a number of website breaches where they, either take over a website or they access a website to get into the back end. We've seen it where they're accessing a website and they pull everything down to then go create a fictitious form of that website to try to redirect people there. Yep. And so it's on those particular situations, it's a little bit more difficult to ascertain what we call that dwell time, which is the time that they were in there for. But answers have done the best about being in the longest, especially when they focus on data exfiltration, because all that they're trying to stay under the radar. And so the longer there, the more that data you can kind of slowly leak out and see. No one's going to be on their computer. Go, man, the internet's slow right now. He goes, oh my God, somebody's exfiltrating data. Those guys are much better trained in that, and so that's why they're in there for longer periods of time, so they can sit under the radar, do what they need to do, and then when they're done, flip the switch and you're dead in the water.
That's great. Hey, as we wrap up, Chris, and I really appreciate this, give us some insight on the cybersecurity insurance industry right now. Is it, we've spoken to people that have said that unlike several years ago, it has really hardened. It has gotten very difficult for small and mid-sized businesses to even obtain cybersecurity insurance. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I would say that, there was a period of time, depending on a particular industry you're in, it really, size wasn't as important. I mean, size is important, but that's a certain, and I'm not a insurance underwriter or anything of that, but I know enough of it to kind of speak to it to a certain extent. A lot of it was really kind of came down to the industry that you're in and, the size, right? So if you're a certain, because there was sometimes where you might be bigger than they want to write, right? Your revenue size might be to a certain degree where you're too big to write, you're too small to write, so you fit in the sweet spot in the middle. And the insurance side for before all this stuff really started popping, I mean, they were selling policies and things were going good. Claims were there, but the premiums being paid, that it's a business, right? And everybody was happy. When you start seeing these larger scale attacks and the damages, and then you also have seen laws kick in that require even more legal work and notifications, and there's a lot of expense with notifying people that have been compromised.
Yep.
Yeah, you start to see the insurance carriers say, hey, look, we're gonna dig deeper now, and we're gonna look at things a little bit more closely, and we are going to not just be so lax when we're writing policies. And then, hey, we're going to have certain requirements. And, I've seen them all over the board. I mean, I've seen carriers out there that have 4 or 5 pages worth of questions that you have to answer. Some of those questions, I'm like, I don't even understand what that question means, but you put it on there. Okay, whatever. You probably found some security guy in the corner that had nothing better to do.
Wanted to throw a bunch of acronyms at you.
Yeah, something that doesn't even apply to somebody that's got 10 employees. But anyway. And then you have other carriers that don't have as many questions that are still trying to ascertain. But I think the other key is that, hey, you can still get it, right? I think what I've heard is cyber insurance, yes, the pricing has gone up, but other forms of insurance have gone up as well.
Right.
And it's still overall an affordable thing to get. And so if you're not getting anywhere with a particular broker, you may talk to another broker to see if they have another carrier out there that's willing to write you. There's different ways of doing it, but usually when I hear somebody that can't get policy, it's just because they're like either in some kind of super high critical industry,
right,
or they don't have the things in place that they need to have in place. So they just, multi-factor authentication on 365 and admin accounts. They just aren't willing to do that. So they don't get rid. I don't blame the carrier for saying no.
So given your experience at Solace, and we'll have, for the listeners, we'll have the link to Solace Security in the show notes, and where you can reach out. We'll have your LinkedIn profile as well, Chris, so that people can reach out to you, connect with you, because the insight you've got is just phenomenal. What advice, what are some of the top 5, 3, whatever things based on your engagement after the fact, after a massive data breach occurs for a small and mid-sized business? What are the things you're finding that they should have done? Like, what would be your top recommendations for best practices?
Yeah, the number one would be just what we talked about with passwords and multi-factor authentication. I mean, that's not the silver bullet, but that is so important. And
it's a baseline, right?
It's such a baseline, and Microsoft has come up with different ways to implement MFA from a policy perspective. So I would say, if you're going to you need to do MFA, but when you do it, look into it some more. And if you have a technology provider involved, then let them give you some guidance around that, right? Say, hey, this is better. Like, for example, with Microsoft, you can do multi-factor, just pops up on your screen, says approve or decline, right? Well, the problem is it's real easy for somebody to say approve. And then they go off and do whatever they do. At 9:00 at night on a Saturday, hit approve. I didn't think anything about it. Next thing you know, you come in Monday morning, your account was compromised because you weren't paying attention. So there are things to that. So I'd say that's number one. Number two is remote access is incredibly important. And so when I'm talking about remote access, I'm talking about for employees, I'm talking third parties and that type of thing. We've seen, a number of situations where a business has a piece of software and that vendor supports that software is installed on the server there.
It's the vendor security, right?
They're just not, they're not paying attention to it, or they just have a bunch of tools that just have sat around forever. When we get into cases, one of the things we get in there, we're like, hey, we see this. Do you know what this is for? No. So we have to figure out, was it installed there for a legitimate purpose and deleted, or it should have been deleted, or did the bad guys get in there and install that? Because that's what they do. They just install that normal remote access that everybody else does. Yeah. And so that's another big thing to be on top. So that would be number two on the remote access. Number three is really, you need to be very active about being on top of your data, where it goes, where it sits, why it's there, why it needs to be there. A lot of people go, well, we need that for research purposes. Well, it doesn't need to be there for everybody to access all the time.
Exactly. Who needs access to it? Right?
Yeah, store it away somewhere, archive it, get it away, if you have to have it. But really, you should be convincing yourself to delete it. And that's really key.
Absolutely.
I'd say fourth, I would say fourth would be we talked about that remote access. I'd say just more around vendor management, right?
Mhm.
Even if you have, there's great IT providers out there, but you should just not, you should question them. You should find out what they're doing. You should find out that if they're all the things that they're telling you to do from a security perspective, they're doing themselves,
Well,
right?
we've seen
So
some of the largest breaches, and when you look at the Target breach, they weren't breached directly, they were breached through their HVAC vendor,
that's
right?
exactly right. And they were doing a lot of things great, but the
They
problem
were,
was they didn't
right.
have any evidence. So they actually got hammered even worse because they couldn't prove it, back to that earlier point. And
That gets back to the compliance piece,
yeah,
right? Like the
exactly right.
showing the evidence, documenting that you have those things done.
Right. And the fifth one would be incident response readiness is what we're calling this now. And so it's a very
Mhm.
important term versus just
Like
incident response
operational
plan.
resilience, right? Like it's the
Exactly right.
practice annually of, if this happens, who knows what, who says what to whom, who is on first, who's on second, what do we do next, right?
You're right. And don't just think of it as a technical exercise. If you just have
Right.
IT doing it, you're missing the boat. It needs to
No, it's
have
got to
legal
involve
components.
HR, right? Am I
Yep.
right? It's got to involve HR. It's got to involve legal. It's got to involve anybody handling social media, PR. Like, who's going to
Hey,
communicate? Who's going to
if you
do
have a
this?
board, we
Right.
see a lot of times where,
Stakeholders.
yeah, especially with nonprofits, the way things are written, they can't get approval to do jack squat unless they have a board meeting. And so those are the things you have to take into account, because you get an instant response situation, you got to make decisions quickly, but you're like, oh man, we legally cannot make that decision. We have to have an emergency board meeting and we got to call board members and they got to have 72 hours notice, all that stuff. That's the kind of stuff you need to feed in and take into account when you're doing your incident response. So yes, plan, incident response, operational resiliency, great term there, as well as just being able to test it. And not only just test it annually, that's good, but if you have some material changes in your environment, you acquire somebody, you change out some infrastructure, you move to the cloud, that should trigger you to revise your incident response plan and test it again. So you may find yourself testing it multiple times a year just because of the rate of change in your organization requires it.
Absolutely. So I'm going to, as my last question to you, I want to ask you this because I think there should be a number 6. I'm just going to throw it in there. Here's my question for you. How many of the organizations, when you get brought in after a massive breach and you guys get engaged at Solus Security, how many of those do you find had adequate security awareness integrated into their culture ahead of time? What percentage, just roughly?
Well, so I think the term adequate is there. We see a lot of people, they have their employees go through some form of training, but I don't think it's enough, if that makes sense. It's not focused on what they should do. It's very generalized. So there's some great general security awareness training, but that should be more of just kind of a reinforcement, in my opinion. You really need to look
Yeah.
at having something that's specific to your policies, specific to your industry, and specific to your culture. And
And
so I'd say,
ongoing, right? Like so
yeah,
many
and ongoing.
organizations, especially in the small mid-sized space. Well, when we onboard, they have a video that they watch and they sign this form.
I would
Okay.
say a lot of them
It's
don't
3
have that
years
though.
ago. They've been here for
Yeah.
3 years. What are you, and oh, they get an email on Tech Tuesday on how to
Yeah.
spot a fish. I'm like, how do we know if they read it? How do we know that they have absorbed it, understood it, and then modified their behavior? We don't, right? So
You're
sending that
exactly right.
email, while it's important, it's not, we don't know that it's, again, the compliance versus security, right? We don't have the evidence that it actually sunk in. So having it ongoing, testing them, like it's the
Yeah.
security awareness aspect of operational resilience.
You should
Would you
interview.
agree with that?
Yeah, I completely agree, and I also agree. When you interview people, you should probably ask them some cybersecurity stuff in there to see know who
It's
you're
a great
getting when you
point.
hire on, right?
Yeah, it's
But
a great
yeah,
point.
you're right. I think you're assuming that a lot of people do training on when they onboard employees. First of all, you got to assume that small companies are actually have some kind of onboarding process, and they're just like, hey, go sit with Nancy over there and see what she
Right.
does. But even if they do, I don't think they're doing the cybersecurity awareness training on during an onboarding thing. So,
Yeah.
but you're right. For those that do, that they never see it again, or they see the same thing year after year, that's not going to be appealing. They're not going to
Not going
register
to
or
be
remember that.
effective.
When I do training, I try to relate personal stuff as well. So I say, hey, look, this applies
Absolutely.
to you in the business world, but it's also going to help you in your personal life as well when you're online. And I think that
Yeah.
helps.
Absolutely. And when we do it, we always focus on what's new and what's relatable to that specific organization, right? And we do it
Yep.
in a bunch of different ways. We do it interactively, we show video, and then we speak with them engaged because people learn different ways. We kind of look at it like it's a professional development, right? Well, as such, these employees are students, and students learn in different ways. Some are auditory, some are visual, some need to write stuff down. So we do it all those ways, and we do it regularly, right? So that it becomes
Exactly
kind
right.
of part of the culture.
Yeah, you gotta
So
interactive is a big deal. I think COVID kind of
yeah,
destroyed a lot of that, but you gotta
yeah,
give it the ability for people to ask questions and say, "Well, I
absolutely,
saw this, or I heard this, or I read this."
right.
That's important in an educational situation as well.
That's phenomenal. Hey, Chris Laird, thank you so much, man. Great discussion. So, everybody, Chris is going to be at Right of Boom over in Texas in the coming weeks, and we'll have a link to that. And then we'll have a link to Solace Security. Check them out. These guys are the best around. So, we're really excited. Thank you so much, man. Really
Hey,
appreciate it.
appreciate it. It was awesome. Good
All right.
content,
Won't
good
be the
questions.
last
I
time we
enjoyed every
talk,
minute.
man.
All
Yeah, we're
right.
just getting
Thanks.
started. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. Bye. Well, that wraps this up. Thanks for joining, everybody. Hope you got value out of digging deeper behind the scenes of security and cybercrime today. Please don't forget to help keep this going by subscribing free to our YouTube channel at Cybercrime Junkies Podcast, and download and enjoy all of our past episodes on Apple and Spotify podcasts so we can continue to bring you more of what matters. This is Cybercrime Junkies, and we thank you for joining us.